Hello and welcome to another edition of Vlog, where I just kind of turn on the camera, choose a subject, and ramble about it for 30 minutes or so. Subject for this week, I want to talk about comprehensible input in young learner classes. So first disclaimer right off the bat, this is for English as a second language teachers. If you're not teaching English as a second language, this is not going to be interesting for you. So fair warning. Secondly, a little bit of background on this. This was a workshop that I did. I first did it almost 4 years ago at this point. It was kind of the winter of 2015. I've since done it. I've run it about 3 times in various forms across a couple different schools. But yeah, let me give some background for this. I was teaching at a school, and I had been primarily teaching the adult classes for a long time, but then I was making a transition to the young learner classes. And I began to notice that for the young learner textbooks, the textbooks that were used for the children and the teenager classes were very grammar heavy. Much more grammar heavy than the textbooks we were using for the adults. And I was talking with a coworker and I said, boy, there's a lot of grammar points these kids have to learn for the test. And my coworker said, well, yeah, but they're young learners. You know, they're just naturally good at soaking up language, so it's okay. And I thought, no, that's not right. Because I'd been reading some books and stuff like that. So I was aware that actually the research shows that in a foreign language classroom, young learners actually learn the grammar points slower than the adults do. I was also noticing around about this time that the more kind of better young learner teachers, the more experienced ones, were not doing a lot of grammar lessons. They were focusing a lot on different types of stories and activities that involved a lot of kind of ideas focus more than grammar focused. Basically kind of giving the kids tons of input. And the kids seem to be learning better, and they also seem to be enjoying the classes more. I used to kind of observe a lot of colleagues just from my own professional development in those days. So this kind of combined with some stuff I'd been reading at the time, and I kind of put together a theory that the young learner classes, by young learner I'm kind of defining anything kind of below 16. So all the way from, like 4 years old to 16, all in any kind of pre-adult class. Learn much better if you focus less on grammar and more on giving them language input. Input here just kind of broadly means kind of, well, it could mean anything, but movies, reading stories, listening to stories, poetry, songs, plays, just kind of any time they're kind of getting exposed to the language but not focusing on the grammar, I guess is the input here. So I asked to kind of put together a workshop on it. And even though this workshop was somewhat critical of the school's curriculum, they were very gracious about it. And they said, yeah, you can do this. And I put together the workshop. I reran it a second time at a different school, although I changed it slightly. I just said the advantages of input in the classroom. Not only for young learners, but also for adults as well. Just kind of broadly speaking, the advantages of input. In the years since, this has been about 3 or 4 years ago since I've done these workshops, I've been reading a lot, and what I've continued to read has more or less reinforced what I did in the workshop 3 years ago, with a few caveats. I guess maybe not even some caveats, maybe things to think about, things I've been thinking about in the back of my mind. I can talk about this workshop, and I can talk about it the same way I talked about it 4 years ago. There are a few things I've started to think about since then. I don't want to complicate things too much, so I'll just kind of talk about the workshop as I did it 4 years ago, but just kind of briefly list the things that I've kind of noticed since then. First of all, I've learned that the learners have to be on board with whatever program you do. So it's no good saying, I'm the teacher, I will decide what's best for you. They have to be on board with it. So if they're like, why are we watching this movie? This is a waste of time. We should be studying the grammar. To a large extent, it doesn't matter what the theory or the linguistic studies say. If the learners aren't on board with it, it's not going to fly. They have to be on board with whatever learning program they're doing in order to kind of get motivation and kind of get them paying attention and get them all the things that you need to get them engaged to have successful learning. So if the learners are resistant to this, it's not going to work. The other variable is kind of how much input they're getting outside the classroom. One of the reasons I think that input was so important when I was teaching in Cambodia and Vietnam is because I was relatively convinced my students weren't getting a lot of English input outside of the classroom. They were watching American movies, but they were either watching the American movies were dubbed. In Cambodia, it was very popular to dub these movies, or they were subtitled. And if they're subtitled, you're still getting some listening practice, but I think it's minimal. My understanding of human attention is that it's very difficult to read in one language and listen to it in another. You kind of tend to do one or the other, meaning if you're reading subtitles, you are largely tuning out the language that you're listening to. I think we've all had experiences kind of watching foreign movies with subtitles. You do pick up the odd word here and there, but you're largely tuning it out. Of course, and if it's dubbed, then that's, completely no language input. Anyways, if you knew or if you suspected that your students were getting a lot of input outside the classroom, then that would be a justification for doing something else inside the classroom. The other thing, I guess, is classroom time is limited. So if there's other important things you want to get to, that's a factor. And then the other thing is, I think I picked this up on the TEFL show. They were saying studies have shown that kind of 4 hours of input a week or less doesn't have quite as much beneficial effect. I've never really been able to track down where their reference was for that, but I think even if it turns out that's not an accurate reference, I think the principle has got to be true, right? At a certain point, the input by itself is not going to be very beneficial. For example, if you have the class for 5 hours a week, I think you can do a lot with input. If you're only seeing the kids for 1 hour a week, then maybe the gains from input aren't going to be as much. And maybe in that case, if you only see them for 1 hour a week, it's better to just drill vocabulary for that 1 hour and see, by the end of this lesson, they will know these 5 vocabulary words. Maybe that would be a better beneficial use of the time than trying to kind of give them input. All those caveats out of the way, I'm just going to launch into it now. So caveats are done. For the rest of this, we're kind of on board with the theory. And this is kind of more or less the workshop I gave 4 years ago. So it starts off with kind of an examination of what is the difference between adult learners and children learning a foreign language. And people always say kids learn languages easier. And kids learn languages faster. But actually the research shows that that's not completely true in all situations. Sorry, I had the PowerPoint all set up, but the computer went to sleep here. There are 2 situations. One is an immersion situation. So An emergent situation is like when you actually move to the country. So imagine like an immigrant family moving to America, completely immersed in language. The adults start picking up the language almost immediately. They're kind of using some of their metacognitive abilities to kind of figure out what the different parts of the language are, where are the nouns, where are the verbs, what are the greetings, and they start experimenting with it almost immediately. Children go through a long silent period in a foreign country where they don't say anything. They're just listening to everything around them, but they don't say anything for several months. And then when they do start speaking after several months, it's just kind of isolated words or kind of memorized phrases. After 10 months, though, they're starting to get an advantage. And by this point, they're starting to kind of catch up to the adults. And finally, after 5 years of being in the foreign country, at this point, then the children are better than the adults. Now, that's in an immersion setting. That's if you kind of take these children and put them in America. If you're teaching them in a classroom, then it's completely different. If you're teaching them in a classroom, sorry. Again, the adults start off much quicker than the children. They tend to pick up things quicker. The children are learning it slower, and the research seems to indicate that they never actually catch up to the adults. So like if you have an adult class and a children's class and they both start learning the language at the same time, even after 5 years, the adult class will still be ahead of the children's class. Now, arguably, younger might still be better because, the children have like more years to live on this planet. So, if you start at 5, versus somebody who starts at 30, that 5-year-old has like an extra 25 years he's going to live after he started studying. But in terms of like year by year, the children's will never catch up to the adult classes in a foreign language. The adults just kind of learn quicker in a foreign language, and the children never seem to catch up. Now, why is this? That's the million-dollar question. Nobody really knows. There are a few different possibilities. One is that there just aren't enough hours in a foreign language classroom. So, for example, if you compare this to an immersion setting is like 10 months before the children are like beginning to catch up with the adults. But that's like 10 months of like 24/7 being exposed to English. If you're only studying English like 3 hours a week at school, you can imagine how many weeks that ends up being before that equals kind of the amount of exposure you get in actually being in the country. But another theory is the way that foreign languages are traditionally taught at school, meaning a focus on the grammar rules, is something that adults are much better at than children. Adults are much better at figuring out the rules of the grammar, remembering the rules, being conscientious about trying to use those rules when they're speaking or writing. Children are not good at this. And so they're not good at doing it cognitively, like having to actively think about these rules. And so that's probably another reason why they just do worse than adults in a foreign language classroom. So, what are the strengths of young learners and what are the weaknesses? The weaknesses, they're very bad at what we call deductive grammar exercises, where you say, look, here's the grammar rule, now do it in the workbook. They tend to have a very hard time kind of concentrating on the rule, remembering to always use that rule. And the more complicated the grammar, the worse they get. They're very bad at kind of consciously monitoring their grammar when they're speaking and remembering the rules. The strengths of young learners. All right, so Given sufficient exposure, if you expose them to enough language, they're much better at mimicking the sounds of the language than adults. So their pronunciation is much better with exposure. If you give them enough exposure, they're much better at developing listening skills than adults. Their listening can become much sharper than adults if they get more exposure. And given enough exposure, they're able to develop a more intuitive grasp of the language. The whole thing like, I don't know the rule, but that sentence just sounds wrong. Or, that sentence sounds right. I can't explain why. It just sounds right to me. That kind of intuitive sense that native speakers kind of have of a language. Children can develop this given it sufficient exposure much better than adults can. So, if you're teaching children, and if you have them for a few hours a week, I think it's a mistake to just focus too much on grammar. I think grammar has its place, so I'll come back to that. There should be some grammar, but I think children would benefit much more from just getting a lot of reading and listening. Talking about input now, and I guess here's where we come to Krashen and his theories. So Krashen famously proposed that all you needed to learn a language was just tons of input, tons of listening, tons of reading at a level you could understand, and you don't need to study the grammar. You get the grammar for free. This has been controversial. Nobody knows. There have been all sorts of studies done over the past 30 years, but the jury is kind of still out. It appears that you can pick up a lot for free just by reading and listening. So kind of, the glass half full. You can pick up a lot of stuff just by reading and listening. There are also some grammar points that appear to be difficult to just pick up for people learning a foreign language. And for these, you may need some kind of grammar instructions. So I'm not kind of a pure Krashenite in the sense that I don't think the only thing you need is just input. But I think input and grammar lessons would kind of work together in this way. Let me start with the wrong way to do it first. What you don't want to do, the wrong way, is you walk in, you're like, okay kids, here's the new grammar point. You've never seen it before. Let me explain what it means. Now let's practice it. Okay, now I want you to use it in the speaking. Okay, now you've got it. Those kind of lessons are just a disaster. Where I think the grammar can kind of supplement the input quite nicely is if you have a class and you start exposing them to tons of reading and listening materials over the weeks and over the months and maybe even over the years that you had them. If you do that, they will get exposed to all of the kind of grammar structures that will be common in the English language if they get enough input. You wouldn't even need to select the input for grammar. If you just give them a lot of input, all the grammar features will be there. Hopefully, they will start to kind of notice some of these grammar features on their own. They might even start to try and make guesses about what they mean. At this point, if they've been kind of reading and listening for several weeks or several months, then maybe you could do a lesson in which you just taught the grammar receptively. So like they don't have to use it yet. You just say, okay, you may have noticed this grammar coming up in a lot of the reading and listening we've done. And if you kind of keep a log of kind of all the reading and listening materials you've been using with these students, you can even go back through and pick out grammar points that you can pick out the grammar from the reading and listening you've done. This is very easy to do with a computer. I've been doing this myself. So like we've been watching a movie, we've been working with the movie script in class. I've got the movie script on my computer. I just do find all sentences with such and such, The computer kind of picks up all those sentences. So you can bring the student's attention to this grammar point that they've already been exposed to over several weeks, but you don't make them speak it yet. Then, hopefully, after you've brought it to their attention, then as they continue reading and listening more and more in the next few weeks, if they haven't already started to notice it, then they'll start to notice it even more. They'll be like, oh, hey, that's that grammar point we studied. I'm noticing it a lot now that the teacher pointed it out to me. And then, after all that's been done, so this is kind of like the long game, kind of several months or weeks now, then that would be the ideal time to do a lesson on that grammar point. And at that point, maybe they'd be ready to produce. Or not. It's a little bit complicated to say when they're ready to accurately produce a grammar point. But at that point, at least, they'll be at a very strong position to kind of be ready, be receptive to kind of the teacher kind of encouraging them to use it at that point. So that's how I would kind of use grammar and comprehensible input together in the class. And the rough estimate I usually do is I try and spend like 80% of the time on input, maybe 20% of the time on grammar. That's very rough. And from class to class it differs. And of course, I have external tests I need to pay attention to and stuff like that. But if I have the kids for 2 hours, I might spend an hour and a half doing reading and listening activities and only a half hour on grammar. And that's how I kind of like to stage it. So the next question is, if you have an hour and a half that you want to do on reading and listening activities, what do? The other problem, there are a few problems here, is kids have short attention spans, and the younger they are, the shorter the attention span. So, like if they're 12, that's one thing, but if they're 4, that's something completely different, right? And also, paying attention to anything in a foreign language is extremely cognitively demanding. I don't know if anyone's experienced this, but I remember when I was in Japan, kind of, listening to lectures in Japanese, and just after about 15 minutes, my brain would like snap, and I couldn't pay attention anymore. I just got overloaded. It was just so difficult for me to kind of concentrate on the Japanese. So that's what a lot of our students are feeling like in English. So my general rule of thumb is to kind of limit whatever input I'm doing to maximum 10 minutes at a time, and then kind of switch it up. And the younger the kids, the smaller I bring that down. So for example, for teenagers, I might show them 10 minutes of a movie. For 6-year-olds, it might be 3 minutes of a movie. And then on to the next activity. So if you're varying this up, these are a lot of different activities that I've started to do in my classrooms. The first one is kind of reading and listening activities. So storybooks are a great way to do this, just kind of reading a story together. Now, depending on the age and the level of the student, you've got a lot of different options. There are graded readers which are published by various publishing houses. And you can get a lot of great stories. I found that for kind of children, including teenagers, horror stories work great. So for example, I've had great luck with Dracula, not the original version, but the simplified grader reader version for English students. Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera, the kids love this stuff. Now these come with a CD usually from the publisher. So you can play the CD, you make photocopies of the book, hand out maybe one chapter a lesson, play the CD, and they listen to the CD and they read it at the same time. And this is a way of kind of doubling the input. They're getting the input from the CD and they're getting the input from following along as well. So it reinforces each other that way. In cases where your school doesn't have the CD, For example, the school I worked at in Cambodia had CDs for all these graded readers. The school I work with in Vietnam doesn't have them. Or where a CD is not available for whatever reason, then the teacher can just read it out themselves. And you know, I'm not a voice actor, but I do my best. I try all the dramatic voices. So that's one option. Another option is with a picture book or a storybook. These work great for younger children. If you have a small class and a big picture book, you can kind of sit them down in front of you. For bigger classes, I've kind of put the picture book on the PowerPoint. I either found a PDF online or I scanned it myself, and I put the picture up and I tell the story as they look at the picture. I found actually that pictures work great kind of all the way up. So even with kind of my older, more advanced students, I've been using comic books recently, where I put the comic book up on a PowerPoint and I kind of read it together with them. And they love it. You know, if you find a really good comic that can grab their attention. So that's kind of reading and listening to stories is one option. Movies is another option. Now, I was reluctant to use movies in my classroom for a long time because I kind of associated it with lazy teachers. You know, lazy teacher just puts on a movie. And we all know those type of teachers. But movies are just so great for learning a language. I think it's almost a pity not to take advantage of this. And I think you could just put on 10 minutes of a movie and not do anything, and they get something out of it. But, you know, because we teachers like to look busy and look like we're doing something, I will usually design worksheets around the movies. I'll kind of pick out vocabulary that will come up in the movies, or I'll give them the transcript and I'll delete certain words. So they have to kind of read through the transcript and write in the words. Sometimes I'll do it as a prediction activity. So here's the transcript, here are the words. Write in the words you think, all right, now let's listen to the movie. Sometimes, this is really labor intensive, but you can find websites online that have all the screen caps of certain movies, especially like Disney movies, animated movies. I put the screen caps together with the dialogue from the transcript and kind of make a PowerPoint where each line of the movie is kind of shown with a picture and the line of dialogue. So they read through it first and then listen to it afterwards. Or kind of usually what they do is they listen first, then read through it, then listen again. It's a great way to kind of build up bottom-up listening and to kind of really focus in their attention on kind of all the words in the movie script. I can be a bit of an old man sometimes and be like, these kids, too much time watching stuff on their computers. Why don't they go play outside or something? I do have that tendency in me, but movies are just such a great learning tool for languages. The visuals are there. The words are kind of very, they've got voice actors or actors, so it's often very clearly articulated. The visuals kind of reinforce the meaning. It's just a great way to learn languages. Okay, other things. Songs. Songs are great. I used to use one song every lesson. There are a ton of ways to use songs in the classroom. I once knew a guy who did a whole workshop on all the different ways you could use songs in the classroom. The most obvious one is just a gap fill. Jokes, I tell one joke in every class. Poems, I give out poems to all my students. Plays, you can read a play together, get the students to act it out. Students talking to each other. As a teacher, you can talk to the students. I know in the CELTA they told you not to do that, but don't listen to them. There's a lot of good evidence that that's quite good for the students to talk to them. The students can write stuff and then read what each other has written. Sorry, I'm talking quite fast because I'm just at the limit here. This camera has a 30-minute time limit. I'm going to stop it here. I may follow up at some point later with a second video of all the different ideas. but not this week.